This holiday season, step into the world of Scrooge, A Christmas Carol, the award-winning audio drama podcast from Hope Media Group and Compassion International. Returning for its 2024 season, this classic tale of redemption and forgiveness is brought to life like never before. Whether you're gathered with family or listening solo, Scrooge is the perfect way to embrace the true meaning of Christmas. Feel the power of the season's spirit with a story of transformation and hope. Catch Scrooge, A Christmas Carol wherever you listen to podcasts or at scroogepodcast.com starting November 22nd. This year, let the story move you and remind you of the joy of forgiveness and the magic of Christmas.
One of my absolute favorite Organifi beverages is back for the season, Organifi Gold Pumpkin Spice. This cozy, sugar-free treat satisfies your pumpkin spice cravings while supporting rest and relaxation. Packed with 12 powerful superfoods, this seasonal blend is perfect for unwinding at the end of a busy day, and it helps you get a refreshing night's sleep. Imagine a warm, creamy drink with a hint of spice that's not only USDA certified organic, but also helps reduce stress without any guilt. Just mix it with warm water or your favorite milk for a delicious, dessert-like experience that's the perfect swap for sugary pumpkin spice lattes. But hurry, this blend is only available for a limited time. Head to www.organifi.com/bestofyou and use code bestofyou for 20% off your entire order. That's ORGANIFI.com/bestofyou. Grab your cozy superfood pack treat before it's gone. Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Allison, and I'm so glad you're here to discover what brings out the best of you. This podcast is all about breaking free from painful patterns, mending the past, and discovering our true selves in God. I can't wait to get started as we learn together how to become the best version of who we are with God's help. Hey everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Best of You podcast. I am so glad you're here with me this week and every week, but especially this week as we are diving into a topic that I know so many of you are eager to learn about, and that's neurodiversity, especially focusing on the autism spectrum. So I recently ran a poll. I have a doc. It's called the Best of You question doc. It's very fancy, not fancy at all. It's just a Google doc. We'll link to it in the show notes. But in that doc, I asked you what specific diagnostic categories you wanted to learn about. This was a couple of months ago, and neurodiversity was your top choice by far and away for a specific diagnostic category that you wanted me to cover. And so I am thrilled to bring this conversation to you, especially with today's guest, neuropsychologist, Dr. Donna Henderson, who brings just an incredible wealth of knowledge and expertise in this area. And what I love about Donna is she is just so clear. I learned so much through this conversation. She just breaks things down so simply and so clearly. And so I'm so excited for you to hear from her today. If you listened to last week's episode 129, we talked all about anxiety and the different things that drive anxiety and how to better understand it and manage it. And one of the things I mentioned is that sometimes a root cause of anxiety comes from another condition, meaning that anxiety isn't the primary condition that we need to treat. It's actually secondary. There's something else going on underneath the anxiety. And neurodivergent individuals, especially those on the autism spectrum, tend to experience anxiety more frequently. And so I am thrilled, again, to take this deeper dive into that specific area with Donna today. I want to just start briefly to touch on some of the key terms in case they're not familiar to you. Neuropsychological testing. This is Donna's area of expertise. This is a comprehensive evaluation that helps uncover the strengths and challenges specifically in your brain function. It's often used to identify conditions like autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, and other neurodevelopmental differences. And this type of testing really plays a crucial role in understanding how your brain functions and its unique ways of processing information and engaging with the world. So it can just be so helpful in getting to the root of some of the problems or the challenges that we're facing. And so if you are listening to today's episode and you're interested in finding a professional who does neuropsychological testing, you're listening to this episode and you think, I need to find one of those, there's a filter for these specialists on the website, psychologytoday.com. You can go back to episode 71. In that episode, I walk you through step by step how to locate specific types of therapists in your zip code, in your region. And one of the things I walk you through is how to use psychologytoday.com and the filters on it to find these types of specialists. And one of those filters is testing and evaluation, right? So you can go filter for people who specialize in testing and evaluation, just like our guest today, Donna, does, if you're interested in learning more about neuropsychological testing. So feel free to go back to that episode 71, to learn more about how to find a specialist like this in your area. And so without further ado, I want to introduce you to today's guest, Dr. Donna Henderson. Donna is a licensed clinical neuropsychologist who has dedicated her career to understanding and supporting neurodivergent individuals, particularly those on the autism spectrum. She's been working with clients for over 30 years, and she is the author of the book, Is This Autism? A Guide for Clinicians and Everyone Else. This is just an incredible resource for everyone. As the title would indicate, it's not just for clinicians, it's for anyone who identifies as autistic or who loves someone who is autistic. I am so excited to share with you today's conversation with Dr. Donna Henderson. Donna, I am so thrilled that you agreed to join me today and join the podcast to share with us your expertise. I have a million questions to ask you, but the first thing I want to just touch on here on the front end is this work that you do in neuropsychological evaluations. From my own experience as a clinician, one of the things that I've noticed is the more precise we can get diagnostically, the better we can help people. And so often, people get categorized or pigeonholed with a diagnostic label that doesn't fit well. It's not I talk about well-fitting names. We name something and it's not the right name. And it really has big implications and repercussions, whether we're working with children or loved ones or spouses or family members or ourselves. And so I would love just to hear a little bit about your perspective on what is a neuropsychological evaluation? What is that? What does it mean? What are you looking for when people come to you for an evaluation?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk about this. The way I often explain a neuropsych eval or what I do, I describe myself as a detective. And the mystery is some person, whether it's a child, an adolescent, or an adult, is struggling with some aspect of their life. Maybe they have anxiety or depression or big emotions, or they're struggling in school, or they're not able to meet their social needs, whatever arena they're struggling in. And I have to figure out what's going on there and how can I help them. And I look for clues by interacting with people mostly. So, interviewing the parents, interviewing the individual, having them do different tasks with me so I can see what makes them tick. So a neuropsych eval includes interviews. It usually includes rating scales where, people answer questions, pen and paper sorts of things. And it usually includes some testing, which might be IQ testing, memory, language, executive functioning, attention, different aspects of functioning, and social cognition as well. And to me, the idea is not to get at a diagnosis, although it often does end in a diagnosis or maybe even more than one diagnosis. To me, the real idea is to figure out what the heck is going on here? What makes this person tick? How do they move through the world? What works for them? What doesn't work for them? What are their strengths? And when it comes to all of that and the diagnoses, I think it should resonate with the child or the individual, with the parents. We should all be on the same page. To me, it feels like it should be a very collaborative process where it makes sense at the end of the day, where we all feel like we solved the mystery and we have a roadmap to move forward.
I love that. Once we get sort of a healthier understanding of what's happening, we can find a better path through toward helping the individual thrive. What are some of the primary things you're looking for, especially when we're thinking about things that get missed? I think about kids, right, that I've worked with or long ago when I was brand new, and a parent would just be exasperated by a child's behavior. They can't pay attention in school. They're acting out. They're getting labeled as a problem child. And this is decades ago, before it was more common to think about the brain, to think about functioning, to think about neurodiversity, right? And even then, to use your detective metaphor, I would kind of think to myself, there's something else going on here. This is a good kid. This kid isn't trying to cause trouble. What's going on there? I remember one time I had a young teenage client, family member, ended up giving her an IQ test, and her IQ was off the charts. And so it was no wonder there was some explanation there for why some of her boredom in class, for why some of her anxiety, for some of these other things. And so it does require that detective mindset. What are some of the things you're looking for? And what are some of the primary diagnostic categories that you see getting missed or falling through the cracks with individuals?
Right. So when you were asking that question, one thing that ran through my mind, and I wish I could remember who said this, I just can't, but it might have even been my co-author and friend, Sarah Wayland. Kids aren't giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time. And so often when parents bring kids in, it's because there may be behavioral problems or the kids aren't meeting expectations or aren't being compliant in different ways. And the parents have this experience of, God, he or she is just giving me a hard time. But really, the child is having a hard time. And when I think about it, I do think about it mostly from a brain point of view. And I think back in the day, we didn't think about that as much. We used to think more about, was there trauma? Is the child, depressed? And even if the child is depressed or anxious, not wondering why. I actually worked with a family just this morning where it was just a 6-year-old who is, flipping over desks in school and eloping from school, and very supportive school, super supportive parents, no trauma history. And everyone keeps saying, well, he's anxious, he's anxious, he's anxious. Well, sure. But to me, the real question is, why is he anxious, right? There is no good reason that we can see for him to be anxious. He hasn't experienced trauma or a negative household situation or anything like that. There's something in his nervous system that is driving that anxiety. So I'm trying to get underneath to see what's going on. So a lot of the times that means understanding their sensory functioning, what's going on with their sensory needs or their sensory overwhelm, what's going on with their social functioning. Are they misperceiving cues? Are they confused by basic interactions? I'm looking at some of that stuff.
This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. With Thanksgiving around the corner, what a great time to take a moment and thank the people who've invested in your life. In my case, it's a couple of mentors and a therapist who have made such a difference for me this past year. Along with this special person, there's another person we often forget to thank. That's ourselves. Life can be overwhelming, and it's easy to forget that we're doing our best to navigate it all. Therapy can be a powerful way to remind ourselves of our worth, build positive coping skills, and set boundaries that empower us to be our best. If you've been thinking about starting therapy, BetterHelp is a fantastic option. It's entirely online, designed to fit your schedule, and super flexible. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional cost. Let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/bestofyou today to get 10% off your first month. That's betterhelp.com/bestofyou.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
That's so interesting. That's helpful because we're trying to be trauma informed. We're always trying to look to the past. We're always trying to look to the system. And you said something really powerful there. But what about when we've turned over all the rocks and there's nothing really there and this child is still really having a hard time? You're coming in and really looking at those internal mechanisms, the nervous system, the brain, to try to figure out some of these patterns. And I'm assuming you're looking a lot for patterns. Is that part of it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Patterns. I'm looking at the big picture. I always, when I train other clinicians, I always say, when you're gathering information, it's all about the details. So ask for another story, ask for another example, really get down into the nitty-gritty of it all. But once you've collected all your information, then it's not about the details. Then it's about the big picture, stepping back and looking at this child as a whole, because, and this relates to the other question you asked about what diagnoses tend to get missed. And autism is a big one. And the reason is that so often no one clinician is looking at the big picture of that child. So you might have an occupational therapist diagnosing sensory processing disorder. And then maybe a year or two later, you'll have a speech therapist diagnosing social pragmatic communication disorder. And then at some point, you might get a psychologist or psychiatrist saying, oh, there's some ADHD here. And then a few years later, you might have another therapist saying, oh, you have anxiety. And so everybody's seeing one little part. And these all may or may not be accurate. Quite often they are, but nobody's stepping back and putting all those pieces together and looking at the individual as a whole. That's what a neuropsych does, I think.
That's really helpful way to put it, because any one of those little pieces could be true, has truth in it, but we're trying to get to the root. What is actually, for the most part, as best we can tell, driving all of these different things? Because if we're just treating the anxiety and there's actually an autism spectrum diagnosis up here, we're going to be missing a part of that path toward health.
100%.
Yeah. What do you think as far as getting a neuropsych eval? When would you encourage somebody to take that route? At what point in the journey would you encourage someone?
Ooh, I don't know if I could give you a good answer for that because it's so individualized. It really depends so much on what the problems are, what they've already tried to do, what is working, what isn't working, how much distress there is for the child and for the parents, how available a neuropsych is for them. I will say, I think in most areas of the country, you have to get on a waiting list to get a good neuropsych eval. So if you're thinking about it, it's probably worth making some calls before you think you're fully ready, because you may have to wait anywhere from 3 months to well over a year in some places. So people should be aware of that, because we do very frequently at my practice, for instance, get phone calls where people are sort of at a point, at a breaking point, at a crisis point, or feeling like we're really ready now. And then they're very disappointed when they find out they have to wait. And that's a common experience.
Yeah, that's a really great tip. I guess from my vantage point, when I see people who are really struggling with something complicated, the downside is the cost and the wait time if it's not covered by insurance. But other than that, it's hard for me to find a downside, because you're getting into the details in that whole holistic approach, which can save you time and money in the long run from going down rabbit trails that don't get you to where you want to go. I've just found it to be incredibly helpful to see those results.
It's my experience as well. And I will say, I think most of the people we work with at the end of the evaluation say, we wish we had done this sooner. I hear that very, very frequently.
Let's dive into autism spectrum. Tell me a little bit about how you speak about autism spectrum diagnoses.
So there are, probably 140 million autistic people on this planet, right? If I look at the population of the world at the current prevalence rate of 2.77%, and that's a really huge number of people, and that's a really wide spectrum of people from, people who require 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, very close support for every little thing and very close supervision, all the way to people who are, fully happy and functional in their lives and are getting their social needs met and are contributing to the world in a million different ways and have interesting careers and whatever their life goals are. So it's really hard to talk about 140 million people in one way. And that's where I think we're having a lot of difficulty now finding wording that makes everybody feel comfortable, right? So I would say a few things. One is, in the DSM, the technical diagnosis is autism spectrum disorder. And so when we're talking about medical documentation, applying for disability, those sorts of official things, that's the language that we use. A lot of the people I work with who tend to be autistic people with average to above average intelligence, many of them having later diagnoses in adolescence or well into adulthood. Many of them prefer autistic person over person with autism, because person with autism is medical model. It's putting the person ahead of the problem. So you might say it's a person with diabetes, not a diabetic person. But for this group of people particularly, they feel like this is not a medical problem. This is part of my identity. It's part of who I am. So I prefer autistic person. So that's the language that I tend to use, autistic person. And I think it's also true that somebody can be autistic, meaning having this kind of nervous system, but not have autism spectrum disorder. If they are living their life and they're fine, they're meeting their own social needs, they're meeting their goals, doing whatever it is they need and want to do in this world. And there's tons of people out there like that. They happen to be autistic, but they don't have autism spectrum disorder.
Okay, so let's dive in there a little bit because there's so much to what you just said. You said having this autistic nervous system, the features of an autistic nervous system without necessarily having what would meet the criteria for a quote unquote disorder. Tell me a little bit about what you mean by that.
So what I meant when I said that was, so there are 7 core criteria for, technically for being diagnosed with autism, plus 1. And so when I say someone's autistic but doesn't have autism spectrum disorder, they meet enough of the 7. You don't have to meet all of them, but they meet enough of those core 7. So I know, okay, you have that kind of brain, you have that kind of nervous system. But the plus 1 is, and there's some kind of functional impairment related to it. And so the people I'm saying are autistic but don't need a diagnosis are the ones who live through the world this way. They have this type of nervous system, but they don't have any functional impairment. They're not super anxious or having trouble meeting their social needs or whatever it is. So that's the difference, that functional impairment.
That makes a lot of sense. No, that makes a lot of sense to me. And so can you give us a bird's eye view of those 7 characteristics?
Yeah, sure. So we divide them into 2 main categories. The first category are differences in someone's social or communication skills. There are 3 criteria in this category, and somebody has to meet all 3 at any point in their life. It could be current, it could be by history. So the first of the 3 is all about the back and forth flow of interactions. So intuitively knowing how to greet people, how to share personal information, showing interpersonal curiosity, being reciprocal in conversation, meaning if you say, oh, something weird happened to me this weekend, I say something related to that. There's not one right answer, right? I could say, what happened? Or I could say, my God, something weird is always happening to you. Or I could say, oh, I had a weird weekend too, but it has to be related. And as part of this first criterion, there's also sort of the ability to take somebody else's perspective, to intuitively understand somebody else's intentions, for example, what's going through somebody else's mind to some extent. So it's not just whether or not somebody has these skills, but how effortful it is. So some of these people with less obvious autism can pull off socially typical looking interactions, but they are unbelievably exhausted by them. So they can do it for a short period of time. And then these are kids who may camouflage at school, come home, completely melt down or, go to sleep for many, many hours. So that's the first criterion. So the second one in this category of social and communication differences is nonverbal communication. So that's everything about communicating except for the words. So facial expressions, tone of voice, gesturing, body language, personal space, volume, all of that stuff. Paying attention to other people's and understanding other people's. So if a teacher speaks in a stern tone of voice, knowing the teacher is not yelling, that's just a stern tone of voice, being able to discern all these little differences and also giving off your own nonverbals that are typical and easy for most people to read. So, eye contact is in this one too. And so much of this is about understanding the subjective experience of the individual, because a lot of these kids learn at a pretty early age how to make typical eye contact. But if you ask them their experience of it, they may tell you, oh, I hate it. I hate looking at eyes. They creep me out. Or like, I can't concentrate, but I force myself to do it because I know everybody expects me to. It's not intuitive or comfortable for them as much. Not all of them, but a lot of autistic people will tell you that.
And this is where in these 2, and maybe in the next one, I thought it was interesting what you said. Even the person, the child or the adult that can camouflage, that has kind of figured out how to do it, they're exhausted by it later on. And we're not just talking about introversion exhaustion. We're not just talking about I'm peopled out. It's a level of sensory overload. And I think you even used the word meltdown, where there's a pretty significant, I'm thinking about parents listening, or where you're noticing it's not a typical response to a day with other people or to a social event.
Right, right. It is absolute exhaustion. I had one autistic college professor once say to me, hey, I can go to the department party and be there for 45 minutes and look perfectly typical and completely blend in. And what people don't know is then I'm in bed for a day and a half recovering from that 45 minutes. I mean, we all can get a little tired after socializing, especially post-COVID, like we all, got out of the habit for a while, but this is next level, right? And there's also often sort of a confusion or effort piece to it. They're not intuitively moving through social interactions, but they're putting out thinking, oh, I should smile now. I should put on a smile. Oh, I haven't spoken in 60 seconds. It might be my turn to speak. Is it my turn to speak? I probably should speak now. There's a very conscious thought process, which is probably in part why they're so exhausted.
And so this is where I want to finish getting through the list, but I want to ask you later, this is where I want to ask about specifically therapy for individuals who are autistic, because there is that component, a little bit of putting on a mask. And we talk a lot in traditional therapy about being authentic, figuring out how to show up authentically. And there's a way in which that could create some dissonance also for someone who is autistic, in the sense of, for me to function in a social setting in order to sort of fit in, or in order not to be perceived as, frankly, sometimes negatively, perceived as from anything from socially shy to rude, especially in an extroverted world, I have to go through these motions. I have to learn these skills. And so it makes a therapeutic intervention a little bit different. And I've learned that a little bit as well. So I want to come back to that, but I want to bookmark that. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, it's really hard for me not to jump to that right now, but I agree. We should get through the criteria. Okay.
I am so excited to share with you guys an incredible scientific breakthrough to support our long-term health and wellness. C15 is the first essential fatty acid to be discovered in 90 years. And what's amazing is that studies have shown it's 3 times better, broader, and safer than omega-3. Now, Fatty 15 is made with pure C15, and it's revolutionizing how we support our long-term health by repairing and strengthening our cells from the inside out. If you've been feeling sluggish, sleeping poorly, or just noticing that you're aging faster than you'd like, you may actually be low in C15. Fatty 15 is designed to replenish that essential nutrient and improve your metabolic, liver, and heart health while giving you deeper sleep and even healthier hair and skin. Plus, Fatty 15 is vegan, 100% pure, and free of fillers or preservatives, unlike many fish oils that go bad before they even leave the bottle. With Fatty 15, you get a clean, powerful way to restore your long-term health. Fatty 15 is on a mission to replenish your C15 levels and restore your long-term health. You can get an additional 15% off their 90-day subscription starter kit by going to fatty15.com/bestofyou and using code bestofyou at checkout.
How about some fresh out of the oven gingerbread, bright snowdrop, fresh Iowa pine, and cool peppermint to put you in the holiday cleaning spirit? Made with goodness, not a lot of nonsense. Mrs. Meyer's. See what good can grow. Visit mrsmeyers.com today.
So we're doing the first of the 2 categories, social and communication differences. There are 3. The first one, interactions. The second one, nonverbals. The third one is relationship management, making friends, deepening friendships, keeping friendships, maintaining them over time, understanding relationships. Like if a kindergartner tells you everyone in their class is their friend, that's socially typical. But if a 5th grader thinks everyone in their class is their friend, that shows, they're not having a typical understanding of social relationships. Or if they, think teachers are their friends, that sort of thing. Conflict management comes into this category. Social motivation. People can be autistic and very socially motivated, really want friends, romantic relationship, all that. Or people can be autistic and have very low social motivation. And I've had more than one autistic kid say, no, seriously, I would like to live in a cabin in the woods in Alaska and not see anyone, but my parents can come visit for 1 day a year kind of thing. And they mean it. Right? And so if somebody's very, very socially motivated, that does not preclude autism.
Yeah.
So that's the first category, interactions, relationships, and nonverbals. And you have to meet all 3 currently or by history. So for example, if you have a 15-year-old who makes typical eye contact, but they didn't make typical eye contact until they figured it out, like say 4th or 5th grade, then that still counts towards diagnosis.
Sure. Which is probably also how it can get missed, because they figured it out
Right, exactly. And the other main way, well, one other main way it gets missed is the timeline is different from what a lot of people think. So many people have this wrong idea that it has to be fully evident by age 3. And that's not true. And for a lot of really smart autistic people, particularly girls, it becomes evident around 5th grade. That's when we really start to see it. And if you look back, you can see the signs, but it wasn't ever big enough for people to take note until about, somewhere between 4th and 6th grade typically. So that's a common one. Okay, so that's the first category. The second category of the criteria we call them repetitive and restricted behaviors, RRBs. There's 4 in this category. You only have to meet 2 of the 4. So that confuses people. They think, well, if they don't meet one of them, they're not autistic. But nope, 2 out of 4. The first one is what we informally call stimming. So that is behavior that is repetitive or atypical. It can be any kind of movement. So in sort of the more stereotypical presentation of autism, you might have kids flapping their arms or flicking their hands. A lot of these kids, repetitive picking, repetitive hair pulling or twirling, pacing back and forth repeatedly, just countless different kinds of movements. It can be repetitive speech or unusual speech, like formal language, like my own daughter, with whom I have a very warm relationship, calls me mother, just that formal language. Or it can be repetitive use of objects. So watching the same TV show over and over and over and over again, not 2 or 3 times, but I've had kids who say, yeah, I watched Despicable Me 84 times so far, just in a row, or reading the same book over and over and over again, drawing the same thing over and over again. So that's number 1, repetitive behavior. Number 2 is inflexibility. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're being behaviorally difficult all day, every day. There's pockets of inflexibility. They might have difficulty with change or transitions. They might get stuck in their thinking, stuck in loops, or stuck in their perceptions. They might have very rigid black and white thinking. Like if they don't like someone, that person's evil, black and white thinking about other people. They might be perfectionistic. That a lot of these girls are highly perfectionistic. So that's the second one, flexibility challenges. The third one is interests. And in the stereotypical presentation of autism, you tend to have atypical interests. So airport codes or orange traffic cones, that sort of thing. But in this less obvious presentation of autism, you tend to have typical interests that get really, really intense. So it can be animals, either animals in general or a particular animal. It can be reading, a K-pop band, any pop star, makeup, just typical stuff, but they just do a much deeper dive than most kids do. And then the last of the 4 is sensory differences, not just the sensitivities that everyone's aware of or the sensory seeking, but less known sensory differences. And a big one is called interoception, which is knowing what your body is telling you, knowing if you have to use the bathroom, knowing if you're hungry, knowing if you're anxious, knowing if you're cold or hot, just being able to read those signals from your body as one of the sensory differences. So the second category has 4. Number 1, repetitive behavior. Number 2, inflexibility or need for sameness. Number 3, interests that are intense or atypical. Number 4, sensory differences.
And so those are all of the categories. In that second one, you need to have 2 of the 4, just in that second group. Got it.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And so you might have someone, to go back to this. So you might have someone, you're listening, right? And you're going, oh my goodness, I see this in myself. I see this in, my spouse. I see this in my child. That would indicate an autistic pattern of thinking, an autistic brain, for lack of a better way to put it. Is that?
Maybe. Yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I do live trainings, people always come up to me afterwards to, chat and ask questions. And inevitably, there are 1 or 2 people that say, I think I might be autistic, or I think my child might be autistic. Like they have that instant, whoa, a lot of what you said resonated with me. And I can divide those people into 2 categories. For some of them, it's a passing thought because 1 or 2 things I said resonated with them. So I'll put myself in that category. Once or twice a year, I have a moment of wait, maybe I'm autistic. and I've never identified as autistic and I'm not autistic. But once or twice a year, it crosses my mind because I have some sensory sensitivities and my husband tells me I can be rigid at times and, little things, nothing major. And so it passes very quickly. The more I think about it, the more I realize, nope, I just have 1 or 2 things in common with autistic people. But for that other group, the more they read about it, the more they learn, the more they think about it, the more deeply it resonates, either for themselves or their child or both, right? These things are genetically driven. And for that group, then I think they should take it seriously.
Yeah. I love how you're saying that again, back to this big picture piece. Because me too, I heard a couple of things in what you just said. I was like, oh, the interoception. I have a really hard time with that. But we have to put that against the larger picture of the whole constellation, the overall pattern. We're going to have some things in common, but that doesn't mean we actually have this whole style going into the world. And so then you add that seventh criteria, there's impaired functioning in some domain of my life.
I mean, if anyone comes into my office for a neuropsych eval or a consultation, by definition, there's some functional impairment, right? Something made them call me and make an appointment. And that's true for you, for any mental health clinician. People don't come in just for the heck of it. They come in because they're anxious or they're depressed or they're lonely or they're not doing well in school or at work or whatever it is. So that part is sort of automatic to me, pretty more or less once they're in my office for the most part. And just to be clear, that's number 8. We have 7. So there's the 3 social criteria and the 4 repetitive restricted criteria. So it's those 7 core ones. This would be number 8, not number 7. Yeah.
Okay. This is so helpful just to kind of get the lay of the land. There's a large pattern and it's more than just one thing. There's a spectrum. If I had a dime for every time somebody who either themselves or a loved one has been diagnosed with autism said to me, I thought it was just looked like Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man.
Right. A white male who's overtly odd and has massive difficulty just managing day-to-day life, right? And there are college professors who are autistic people. There are comedians. There, are professional athletes, happily married people, certainly activists out in the community. There are pastors and ministers and rabbis and teachers and absolutely. There is an entire lost generation of autistic adults who don't know they're autistic, right?
I love that you're naming that. And this is where I want to move as we wind down. I want to really honor your time, but just into how do we approach therapy, as I've raised before? In addition to that, just how do we approach when we know somebody has this? I heard a comedian, to your point about comedians, Hannah Gadsby talk, and it was just so stunning how she talked about, and I thought this was a great metaphor. She said, it's like if someone is colorblind. She said, that's how it feels for me going into a social setting. And she said, you don't tell somebody who's colorblind, just see color. Here's all you need to do. They can't go in and see the social nuances. And we live in such a sort of, in many ways, especially in American culture, socially oriented world in a way, or there's such a high premium on that kind of traditional interpersonal skills. And so I have a real soft spot in my heart for folks who are feeling sidelined and marginalized because, to use her metaphor, they feel colorblind and they're just being told there's something wrong with you or just figure it out. Or so with that backdrop, what kind of therapy might be most helpful if you're someone who you or your loved one is in this category? And how can we come alongside those who have this style, this way of being in the world, and just to help be a kinder, gentler, more community-oriented world?
Yeah, I love that. Historically, in the past, once somebody was identified as autistic, the goal of all the adults around them was, well, let's help make them look less autistic, right? Let's teach them how to make, quote, better eye contact. There's no such thing as better or worse eye contact or good or bad eye contact, right? There's just typical and less typical. And all that was doing, I'm not saying there isn't a place for something like that, in that we all have to learn how to be somewhat functional in the world. But the core of therapy should absolutely not be about that. To me, it's about helping, especially if we're talking about children here and adolescents, helping them understand who they are through the lens of neurodiversity. Not you have a disorder called Autism Spectrum Disorder, but you have a different kind of brain than most people have. And so you're in a minority group. And anytime you're in a minority group, that makes life a little bit more challenging. That's not a problem within you, but it is a problem for you. And we're going to work together to help you understand this, to help me understand your experience, to help them understand it. Ideally, they also will have a group experience with other bright autistic kids their age to We all want to connect with other people who understand our experience truly. I think that can be really, really helpful as well. So I think that's the biggest part of it, because these kids are so misunderstood for so much of their lives, and there often is a trauma piece. And I don't necessarily mean like trauma with a capital T, although autistic kids are more likely to have trauma with a capital T, like negative life experiences, like your parents getting divorced, that sort of thing. But they're also more likely to experience typical life events as traumatic. Just walking into the school building can be traumatic for them. And so having that trauma lens, that autism trauma lens in therapy, I think can be very helpful as well.
It's interesting, even when you said how it can be hard to detect the nuances of tone. And so for a child or even an adult, I think about a work setting where they experience stern, someone maybe is having a bad day and has a stern tone of voice. They experience that as being yelled at, and they might go to that black and white. That would weigh more heavily on that person than someone who understands, oh, they just had a bad day. They just used a sarcastic tone of voice with me, who can read the nuances of that. It makes it a little bit harder to just move through the day and move through the world.
A lot harder. We could sit here and talk for many hours about the many different ways that it is harder to move through the world as an autistic person. I'll give you one super quick example. I mean, it's such a minor one, but it's one of 1,000. At my dinner table, on my side of the table is me. I'm a non-autistic ADHDer, and my youngest daughter, who has the same neurotype. And then across the dinner table are my two old, when they're home, are my two older kids who are both autistic. They live off at college. My husband sits at the head of the table. Anyway, so one day my youngest was telling a story and my older two weren't making any eye contact. And as a non-autistic person, I experienced that as rude and it bothered me. And so at one point I said, hey, you guys, how about some eye contact over here for the non-autistic people? Because that's how we talk to each other in my family. And they laughed. And then they put me in my place, rightfully so, and said, why should we have to make eye contact just because it feels more natural to you? Like, we know we have to do it out there in the world. We get that and we accept it, but we shouldn't have to come home and do it here in our own home when it's uncomfortable to us. And that doesn't mean it was wrong for me to want eye contact either. Nobody's right. Nobody's wrong. It's a matter of talking openly and leading with curiosity about our differences and having communication about it. And I think that is probably the most helpful thing of all.
I love that. You said right before we started recording something about we're a family of different neurotypes. Every family is a family of different neurotypes. And in your family, I love literally, you each know your type. And there's a way in which then you're negotiating. One of you is saying, I'm done with eye contact for the day. Another is saying, I need some eye contact. And this is a family. And I love that, because this whole podcast is kind of all about, like, how do we come together for the good of the whole, right? We bring our individual selves, we bring our individual neurotypes, whether we're neurotypical or atypical, whatever the framework is, but we're coming together trying to create harmony, which doesn't mean normalizing one over the other. It means each person learning how to honor the other. That's true in relationships. That's true in a family. I love that. But I think the knowledge really helps, right? You can each name it, and that really helps with the understanding and with the communication.
Oh, it makes all the difference in the world. I'm actually working on a training right now with a brilliant autistic psychologist named Megan Anna Neff. So she's autistic, I'm not, and we're working on a training that is all about cross-neurotype communication. Because once you understand everybody's neurotypes and how they communicate differently, verbally and non-verbally, right? Because both are super important, then so much of conflict and hurt feelings and anger just falls away when you understand.
It's so good. We make so many assumptions about people based on the subtext, the cues, the eye contact, the questions that someone asks or doesn't ask, instead of really seeking that deep understanding and that deep knowledge that we have the power to gain now through people like you who are doing this work. Tell us, boy, I could keep diving into this, but I want to honor your time. Tell everyone where they can find you. You've got some amazing resources to really help people with this. Where can people find you, Donna, and the work that you're doing?
Sure. So I've co-authored 2 books. The first one is called Is This Autism? A Guide for Clinicians and Everyone Else. We realized that a lot of clinicians didn't understand the less obvious presentation of autism and decided to write a book about it. And I gradually realized, oh, nobody understands this. It's not just for clinicians. That's why it's called A Guide for Clinicians and Everyone Else. And that's with my co-authors, Sarah Wayland and Jamel White. And then there's a companion guide for clinicians that I do recommend for clinicians, but for general, like for parents or people who are wondering if they or their child are autistic, it's the first book. It's the guide for clinicians and everyone else. And our website is isthisautism.com. And we also do have some videos there. So if people are more into listening than reading, they can access the same information, more or less, that's in the book in those videos.
I highly recommend, if you've been listening and some things have kind of stood out to you, if you're just aware of like, man, we've tried everything, but nothing's working. And some of the things you listed really kind of rang true about your loved one or about yourself, or just trying to understand some behaviors that don't make sense to you. Just start getting curious. Is it possible there's something in the brain going on here? To just ask that question, or the clinicians listening, is there possibly something here that might fall in this category of neurodiverse or even autism? Because it can be so helpful to understanding, to clarity, and to finding, as you said, that path through. So thank you so much for what you're doing, and really appreciate your time today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of The Best of You. It would mean so much if you'd take a moment to subscribe. You can go to Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts and click the plus or follow button. That will ensure you don't miss an episode, and it helps get the word out to others. While you're there, I'd love it if you leave your 5-star review. I look forward to seeing you back here next Thursday. And remember, as you become the best of who you are, you honor God, you heal others, and you stay true to your God-given self.
Hey, I'm Greer, host of the Unfinished Idea podcast, where listeners and I get to journey together to better understand the neurodiverse world. Together with my husband, we have 2 boys and 2 dogs and raising a child with additional needs. Our day-to-day experience isn't being talked about in everyday life, and I see a gap in those leading people who are neurodivergent. Whether you're a parent, a friend, a teacher, or a neighbor, the neurodivergent world is all around us. So this podcast is for you. I have conversations over a cup of tea or coffee, helping to bring awareness about how neurodivergent people experience the world, as well as families who are raising children with different needs. This podcast will share practical help, tips, and the joys, struggles, and differences in being neurodivergent or raising a child who is. Each week, I will spend 30 minutes talking and interviewing others in the neurodiverse space and giving you the opportunity to learn and grow and feel seen and heard by how we interact with each other and the world. Search for The Unfinished Idea in your favorite podcast app and come learn about the neurodivergent world. I'm looking forward to seeing you there.